In the late 1920s, the young nation of Finland bordered the new and menacing Soviet Union, now led by Joseph Stalin. From a naval perspective, they faced each other on three separate fronts. The Arctic front in those days was essentially barren. These were the days before the Soviet Northern Fleet would grow to prominence. Lake Ladoga was relatively small and barely accessible. The main threat access was the Baltic. Since the days of Peter the Great, the Baltic fleet had historically been Russia's home fleet. For the new nation of Finland, this meant they would be facing the best of the Soviet fleet, whatever that meant. Even with it being in shambles after the Civil War, it was thought the small Finnish economy couldn't match the Soviet fleet. Basically, it was realistically acknowledged that the decisive battles would be on land. As in Poland, the main goal of the Navy would be to protect the Baltic coast and numerous islands from Soviet amphibious invasion. As with Poland and most other small navies, there would be a heavy emphasis on mines. I really cannot overstate how effective mines had been in World War I. However, there was thought to be a need for some big gunships to provide heavy coastal fire support and chase off Soviet heavy units. Meant to operate in the confined Gulf of Finland, they didn't need to be especially seaworthy with long range. Finland's economy and infrastructure wouldn't support that anyway. In fact, they had to turn to Germany for help in designing them. What they needed were small ships with a shallow draft that were cheap. What they needed were coastal defense battleships or monitors. With no heavy weapons industry of their own, they turned to Sweden to arm them. For their part, Germany, using various front companies, was happy to help anyone that would contribute to their technically banned R&D programs for the right price. Germany gets to keep its design bureaus together. The customer, in this case Finland, gets high-quality platforms to defend itself. In this case, the result was the two ships of the 3,900-ton Vainamoninen class. 3,900 tons, standard displacement. Remember that. To give them the punch they needed, they were armed with 254mm guns. That's 10-inch. Again, 3,900 tons. This made them arguably the most heavily armed ships, pound for pound, in the world. In keeping with their coastal rule, they had a draft amount of ship below the waterline of just 5 meters. That's about 16 feet. So yeah, metacentric height would have been a serious concern on the open oceans. But they weren't meant to operate in the open ocean. Even still, they were lively. Most critically, their small size left no room for an appreciable underwater protection scheme. That would cost them. This is odd considering their primary choice of coastal defense was mines. They really should have been fitted with bulges to increase their stability and give them some realistic underwater protection. It probably would have hurt their speed, but that wasn't wowing anyone anyway. They weren't fast. Bulges also would have allowed them to carry more fuel. Their small size kept them on a pretty short leash. They were coastal ships though, so, As they were meant to fight in the Gulf of Finland, which freezes up in wintertime, they had reinforced hulls for ice breaking. In the massive free-for-all known as World War II, Finland found itself fighting 3 wars. The first was the Winter War, when the Soviets invaded Finland from November 30th, 1939 to March 13th, 1940. It could be broken into 2 fronts. In the south was the Mannerheim Line that ran from the Baltic to Lake Ladoga. It was a grinding attritional battle with little room to maneuver, reminiscent of World War I's Western Front in the snow during the coldest winter of the 20th century. North of Lake Ladoga was the Jaeger Front, where groups of Finnish ski troops pinned down Russian columns quasi-guerrilla style in the frozen forest. This was the land of the Sausage War and Simo Häyhä, the White Death. Ultimately, A peace treaty was signed that gave the Soviets everything they demanded pre-war, and more. These included the Rybachi Peninsula on the Arctic coasts, land north of Lake Ladoga that could have been used to threaten the Leningrad-Murmansk highway, all of the Karelian Isthmus, including Lake Ladoga, pushing the border further from Leningrad, several islands in the Gulf of Finland, and the Hanko Peninsula was leased to the Soviets. For Finland, the war was rightfully seen as a tragedy with an unhappy end, but an end where, despite all expectations, they survived mostly intact. For the Soviets, it is often portrayed as a Pyrrhic victory, with over 130,000 killed and at least double that number wounded. Not surprisingly, even to this day, the official numbers are sketchy. Among the casualties was the reputation of the Red Army. Stop me if you've heard this one. Going into the war, the Soviet Army was rated as a mostly fully mechanized force capable of dynamic operational maneuvering. Coming out, it was mostly rated as a lumbering giant by Western countries, only capable of the most basic strategic, operational, and tactical maneuvers, bloodied by a much smaller force. So too did Hitler. In a vacuum, this was terrible for the Soviets. But of course, we don't live in a vacuum. Post-Winter War, the Soviets had the sense to take in the lessons learned and start fixing things. It was just barely in time. If we learn more from our defeats than our wins, getting bloodied in the Winter War might very well have saved the Soviets later. The next war for the Finns was the Continuation War from June 1941 to September 1944. Starting only days after the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, this was an attempt by the Finns to retake the land ceded to the Soviets after the Winter War. Officially co-belligerents rather than allies, Finland worked in concert with the Axis powers. The Finns were mostly apathetic rather than sympathetic to Nazi ideology, but Germany was simply the only ones willing to help them. A common enemy. As part of their alliance, German troops were able to operate out of northern Finland. More on that later. And gave Finland massive material aid. In return, Finland lent troops to the Wehrmacht and took pressure off the German northern arm, helping besiege Leningrad. At first, things went very well for Finland. Pretty quickly, they regained all of their lost territory and even advanced slightly beyond their pre-Winter War borders. Apparently, the idea was in any peace talks, they could bargain away the extra territory and end up back where they began. Finland had no interest in conquering Russia as the Germans did. They just wanted their land back. As such, soon after liberating ceded territories and the buffer, they just stopped, much to the annoyance of Hitler, and dug in. Eventually, though, the weight of Soviet numbers became decisive. Slowly and inexorably, the Finns were pushed back. By the time a peace treaty was signed in September 1944, the borders were again basically back to the post-Winter War lines, and there they have essentially remained. For the Soviets, the Continuation War was another catastrophe. It's been estimated that just in the Continuation War, they suffered around 1 million casualties. But again, the numbers are dubious. For Finland, with hindsight, it was a waste. Not to take anything away from the Finns, but by the end, they essentially gained nothing, and it cost them 250,000 casualties from a relatively small population. The final war for Finland was the Lapland War from September 1944 to April 1945. Remember that part about the German troops stationed in northern Finland I said more on later? Well, this is later. As part of the treaty that ended the Continuation War, Finland agreed to expel them from their country. Slowly, the 200,000 Germans at first kind of dawdled their way back toward the border to occupy Norway. This didn't suit the Soviets, and eventually they pressured the Finns into attacking the German troops to hasten their exit from the country, which it did. For Hitler, it was seen as a stab in the back. As best he could, he wouldn't abandon his allies, nor would he allow them to abandon him. For the German troops, it was also seen as a betrayal, even if they understood the reason. Many of them held the Finns in high regard, professionally and personally. Besides, they were doing their best to leave, but they had a lot of people and equipment to move, and the frozen terrain wasn't helping. Now their allies were attacking them to satisfy Stalin. The Finns weren't keen on it either. More bloodshed, this time fighting the only ones that had actually helped them in their hour of need to appease the ones that had attacked them. Meanwhile, the Western Allies just kind of did nothing. Didn't even include them in the post-war Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. Given this geopolitical you're-on-your-own-ism of the West in its time of need, it's understandable Finland never risked angering Russia by trying to join NATO. Instead, they just hoped that if they didn't give Russia a reason to distrust them, they would be left alone. And it mostly worked. By playing the role of a mostly demilitarized buffer state, they had this unspoken agreement with Moscow. If they don't join NATO, Moscow doesn't give them a reason to, and vice versa. Good plan. In fact, I would go so far as to say someone would have to be a complete paranoid nut job to upset this arrangement. I mean, someone would have to be completely insane to think they could invade a neutral neighbor with a democratically elected government in an attempt to take away their sovereignty and force them to be their ally. I mean, it would probably scare everyone around them into going exactly the other way and start an arms race that benefits no one. Wait a minute. What's that you say? I'm getting word that we have some breaking news coming in. Vainamoninen was started in August 1929 and was completed December 28, 1932. Ilmarillion was started in September 1929 and was completed April 17, 1934. Main armament was 4 254mm 45 caliber guns in two gun, meaning individually sleeved, turrets, one forward and one aft at the main deck level. They fired 225 kilogram, about 500 pound shells with a rate of 2 rounds per minute per gun. Secondary armament was 4 twin 105mm 50 caliber dual purpose open back mounts. One mount super firing each main turret and one mount on each beam at the main deck level. These guns fired a 25.2 kilogram round. Maximum elevation was 85 degrees at 15 rounds per minute. However, they were manually trained and elevated, severely hampering their anti-aircraft usage. Belt armor was up to 50 millimeters. Deck armor was up to 20 millimeters. The turret faces had 100 millimeters of armor. The conning tower had 120 millimeters of armor. Propulsion was diesel-electric, something usually found on submarines. Wink, Germany, wink. 2 diesel engines venting to one funnel generated 6,000 horsepower. These provided electricity to 2 motors, each driving propeller for a top speed of 14 knots. At their most efficient speed of 10 knots, they had an endurance of just 700 nautical miles. When the Winter War started at the end of November 1939, Vainamoninen and fleet flagship Ilmarillion were sent to protect the demilitarized Åland Islands against any Soviet invasion, but that never came. When the Gulf of Finland finally froze over in January 1940, they moved to Turku, where they basically spent the rest of the war as floating anti-aircraft batteries. When the continuation war started in June 1941, they covered the laying of minefields, served as a fleet in being to threaten the Soviet Baltic Navy or Leningrad, and provided fire support for the liberation of the Hanko Peninsula. While returning from one such mission on September 13, 1941, Ilmarillion hit a Soviet mine just south of Uto and sank in just 7 minutes. Afterward, Vainamoninen mostly operated as a guard ship between Helsinki and Kotka for the rest of the war. Post-war, she was handed over to the Soviets as war reparation to reduce the Finnish debt under the "perhaps you think you're being treated unfairly" doctrine, where she was renamed Viborg and used as an accommodation ship until the 60s when she was scrapped.